The gavel struck with the finality of thunder, sealing deals worth more than most people saw in a lifetime. Cornelius Vandermeer adjusted his platinum cufflinks and surveyed the chaos he'd orchestrated at Meadowbrook Farm's foreclosure auction. Every magnificent stallion, every prized mare, every piece of horseflesh that had made the Kerrigan family legendary, all his now. All except one. Sold to Mr. Vandermeer for $4.2 million. The auctioneer's voice cracked with exhaustion. After 12 hours of relentless bidding, the crowd pressed closer, their phones capturing the moment when corporate greed devoured small-town tradition. Octavia. Kerrigan stood frozen beside the weathered fence post where she'd learned to ride. 23 years ago. Her calloused hands gripped the rails as she watched strangers load her childhood memories into gleaming trailers. The horses she'd named, trained, and loved like siblings were reduced to lot numbers and profit margins. "Miss, you need to move." Along now, a security guard tapped her shoulder with false politeness. "This is private property, private property." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. 4 generations of Kerrigans had worked this land, built this reputation, one careful breeding decision at a time. Now it belonged to a man who collected ranches like other people, collected stamps. Vandermeer approached with the swagger of someone who'd never heard the word no. His Italian leather shoes squelched in the mud that Octavia's boots navigated with practiced ease. "Ms. Kerrigan, isn't it? I've heard remarkable things about your family's breeding program." She turned, meeting his calculating gaze with steel in her own. At 28, Octavia had inherited her father's stubborn chin and her mother's fierce green eyes. Both served her well now. "Mr. Vandermeer, I have a proposition," he continued, pulling out a checkbook thick enough to choke a horse. "Stay on as my head trainer. Full salary, benefits, a chance to work with the finest bloodlines money can buy." The offer hung between them like smoke. Around the stable yard, workers continued loading horses into trailers bound for Vandermeer's sprawling Celestial Springs ranch 3 counties over. Each whinny felt like a goodbye. "Generous," Octavia said finally. But no, surprise flickered across his Botoxed features. "No. Do you understand what you're walking away from?" What she was walking away from was selling her soul to the devil who'd destroyed her family. But before she could respond, a commotion erupted near the old barn. Shouting voices, the crack of wood, and then the thunder of hooves on packed earth. A mud-caked Colt burst from the shadows, mane flying like a battle flag. Workers scrambled out of his path as he charged across the yard, past the loading trucks, past Vandermeer's shocked entourage. The animal was a mess coat, matted with burrs and dirt, ribs showing through patchy hair, one ear notched from some long-ago injury. "What in hell?" Vandermeer sputtered, but the Colt wasn't running from anything. He was running to something. To someone. He skidded to a stop directly in front of Octavia, sides heaving, and dropped his great head against her shoulder with absolute trust. "Hello, Maverick," she whispered, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. The crowd gathered, murmuring. This pathetic creature looked nothing like the magnificent animals they'd spent millions acquiring. This was a throwaway, a mistake. Something that had slipped through the cracks of paperwork and possession. Vandermeer's jaw tightened. That animal wasn't in the manifest. "Because he's not for sale," Octavia said quietly, her hand running along Maverick's neck. "He never was." 3 weeks later, Celestial Springs Ranch hummed with the efficiency that only unlimited money could buy. Vandermeer surveyed his new acquisitions from the leather-pointed office that overlooked pristine paddocks and gleaming stables. Every horse he'd purchased was being pampered like royalty, the best feed, the finest trainers, veterinary care that cost more per visit than most people's mortgages. Yet something nagged at him, that filthy colt, that worthless animal that had chosen the farmer's daughter over fortune. Sir, his assistant, Bellamy Winters, entered with a stack of reports. The quarterly projections you requested. Tell me about the Kerrigan operation, Vandermeer said instead, not turning from the window. What made them special? Bellamy shuffled papers nervously. Well, sir, their breeding program was ... unconventional. They didn't always choose bloodlines based on pedigree alone. Sometimes they bred for heart, for spirit. The old man, Finnegan Kerrigan, had theories about genetic memory, about horses choosing their own destinies. Nonsense, Vandermeer scoffed. Horses are animals. Beautiful, valuable animals, but animals nonetheless. Of course, sir, though Bellamy hesitated. There are stories about that colt. Maverick. Some say he's descended from a line that goes back to the Civil War. A cavalry horse that saved his rider by refusing orders, taking a different path that avoided an ambush. Vandermeer's reflection in the window looked skeptical. Local folklore, perhaps, but the Kerrigans kept detailed breeding records. According to their files, every horse in Maverick's line has shown unusual ... intuition. They seem to know things, sense things before they happen. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, Octavia was discovering the weight of freedom. The small apartment above Hendley's feed store wasn't much, but the rent was manageable with her job at the veterinary clinic. Maverick grazed in the quarter-acre pasture she rented from old Jedediah Prescott, who'd known her father and refused to accept full payment. But late at night, when the Kentucky wind whispered through the trees, she felt the pull of something. Unfinished, Maverick felt it too. The colt would stand at the fence line, staring east towards Celestial Springs. His ears pricked forward like he was listening to voices only he could hear. "What is it, boy?" she'd ask, running her fingers through. His now clean mane, the regular meals and proper care had transformed him from scarecrow to stunner. His coat gleamed like polished mahogany, and the intelligence in his dark eyes was unmistakable. The answer came on a Thursday morning when Bellamy Winters appeared at the clinic. His usual composure cracked like old paint. "Miss Kerrigan, I need to speak with you privately." They walked to the small break room, where Bellamy's hands shook as he pulled out a thick folder. "These are the complete Celestial Springs veterinary reports. Every horse, Mr. Vandermeer, purchased from your family's auction." Octavia opened the folder, her trained eyes scanning the medical data. What she saw made her blood freeze. These numbers ... they can't be right. They are. Every single horse is showing signs of distress. Decreased appetite, elevated stress hormones, behavioral changes. Some have stopped eating entirely. The veterinarians are baffled. She flipped through page after page of concerning reports. Magnificent animals that should have been thriving in their luxurious new home were wasting away. How long? It started the day after the auction. "They're homesick, Miss Kerrigan, but it's more than that. It's like..." Bellamy struggled for words. "It's like they're mourning." "Why are you telling me this?" His eyes met hers, and she saw genuine distress there. "Because Mr. Vandermeer is planning to sell them to overseas buyers if they don't improve. He says damaged goods have no place in his operation." The folder slipped from her numb fingers, papers scattering across the linoleum floor. Overseas buyers. That was code for slaughterhouses and research facilities. The horses her family had. loved and nurtured for generations, would be destroyed because they couldn't forget where they came from. There's something else, Bellamy said quietly. He's offered a reward. $1 million to anyone who can bring him that Colt of yours. He's convinced Maverick holds the key to understanding what's wrong with the other horses. Outside, thunder rumbled across the hills, and somewhere in the distance, Octavia could swear she heard the sound of hooves beating a desperate rhythm against the wind. That evening, Octavia sat in Maverick's pasture as storm clouds gathered overhead. The Colt stood beside her, his presence both comforting and unsettling. Since Bellamy's visit, she'd been unable to shake the feeling that something larger was at place, something that went beyond money and ownership. "Tell me what you know," she whispered to Maverick, her fingers tracing the star-shaped marking on his forehead. It was a mark that appeared in her family's breeding records, going back 5 generations. Always on horses that seemed to possess an almost supernatural connection. To their handlers, thunder cracked, and Maverick's head shot up, his nostrils flaring. But he wasn't reacting to the storm. His attention was focused eastward, toward Celestial Springs, and the sound rumbling from his chest wasn't fear, it was a call. Within seconds, an answer came, faint but unmistakable, the whinnying of horses carried on the wind. Not one voice, but dozens, all the horses from her family's farm, calling back to Maverick across the miles. Octavia's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "They won't stop. It's been going on for hours. Please come, BW." She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a familiar harness. These weren't just horses, they were family. And family didn't abandon family, no matter the cost. 40 minutes later, Octavia's battered pickup truck pulled through the gates of Celestial Springs Ranch. Bellamy met her at the main stable, his face haggard with exhaustion. "Thank God you came," he said, leading her toward the sounds of distress echoing from the barns. "It started an hour ago. They're calling to something or someone." Inside the climate-controlled stables, Octavia's heart broke. Every stall held a horse she'd known since birth, Tempest, the grey mare who'd taught her to barrel race, Goliath, the gentle giant who'd carried her father on his last ride before the cancer took him, Aurora, whose bloodline traced back to Secretariat himself. They were magnificent still, but their eyes held a sadness that expensive feed couldn't cure. The moment they saw Octavia, the calling intensified. Heads stretched over stall doors, reaching for her touch, begging for recognition. "I know," she whispered, moving from stall to stall. "I know, babies. I miss home too." Touching came a cold voice from the stable entrance. Cornelius Vandermeer stepped into the light, flanked by 2 security guards, but ultimately pointless. "These animals are mine now. They're dying," Octavia said without turning round. "You can own their bodies, but you can't buy their hearts. Hearts don't win races. Hearts don't generate profit." Vandermeer moved closer, his presence making the horses skittish. "But I'm willing to make a deal. Bring me that worthless Colt of yours. Let me study what makes him special, and I'll consider alternative arrangements for these animals." Octavia finally faced him, and he took an involuntary step backward at the fury in her green eyes. "You want to know what makes Maverick special? He chose love over luxury. He chose loyalty over comfort. Something you'll never understand." "Love," Vandermeer laughed, but the sound was hollow. "Love doesn't exist in the animal kingdom. Only instinct and conditioning," as if summoned by his skepticism. A sound cut through the night that made everyone freeze. Hoofbeats, Not the measured clip-clop of a horse being led, but the thunderous gallop of an animal running free. Maverick burst through the stable doors. Like a force of nature, mud flew from his hooves, his mane streaming behind him as he charged straight toward Octavia. But at the last second, he veered away, racing down the center aisle of the stable. What happened next would be debated in racing circles for years to come. As Maverick passed each stall, the captive horses grew calm. Their whinnying ceased, replaced by soft nickering sounds of recognition and comfort. The colt, who'd been dismissed as worthless, moved among them like a king returning to his court. Impossible, Vandermeer breathed, but Bellamy was staring at something else entirely. In his hand was a tablet displaying the ranch's security feeds. On screen after screen, the same impossible sight. Every gate leading to the ranch stood open. Every lock had been somehow undone. The path Maverick had taken to reach them was marked by a trail of mysteriously opened barriers. "The gates," Bellamy whispered. "They're all open, every single one." Octavia smiled, understanding flooding through her like sunrise. "He didn't just come here, Mr. Vandermeer. He came to show them the way home." Outside, thunder rolled again. But this time, it wasn't the storm. It was the sound of 24 horses, running free. Pandemonium erupted as Celestial Springs Ranch became a whirlwind of chaos. Security guards shouted into radios while ranch hands scrambled to close gates that shouldn't have been open. But it was too late. 24 horses thundered across the manicured grounds. Following Maverick toward the open highway beyond, Vandermeer's face cycled through shades of purple. That would have been comical in any other circumstance. "Stop them. Those animals are worth $40 million. But stopping a stampede of determined horses was like trying to hold back the tide with a bucket. Vehicles roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness as pursuit began. Octavia stood frozen in the stable doorway, watching her family's legacy disappear into the night. "Get in," Bellamy shouted, running toward a ranch utility vehicle. "If we don't find them before they reach the interstate." She didn't need him to finish. Loose horses on a major highway would mean death for the animals and potentially for innocent drivers. Octavia leaped into the passenger seat as Bellamy gunned the engine. They followed the trail of hoofprints and torn grass, Bellamy's driving skills tested by the rough terrain. Behind them, a convoy of ranch vehicles spread out, like a military operation. Ahead, the darkness seemed to swallow sound and shadow alike. "There." Octavia pointed to a flash of movement caught in their headlights. The herd was staying together, moving with purpose rather than panic. At their head, Maverick's distinctive silhouette cut through the night like a beacon. But they weren't heading toward the interstate. They were moving west, toward the old county roads that wound through hill country most people had forgotten existed. Roads that would eventually lead to ... Meadowbrook, Octavia whispered. "They're going home." Bellamy's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That's 60 miles of rough country. They'll never make it." But even as he spoke, they crested a hill and saw something that defied logic. The horses weren't running wild anymore. They were moving in formation, the mares and younger horses protected in the center, while the stallions took point and rearguard positions. It was a pattern Octavia had seen before in old photographs of wild Mustang herds crossing dangerous territory. "They remember," she said in amazement. "The bloodlines, the genetic memory Bellamy mentioned. They remember how to survive." Hours passed. The pursuit continued through valleys and over ridges, past sleeping farmhouses and abandoned homesteads. Vandermeer's voice crackled over the radio, increasingly desperate as his million-dollar assets disappeared deeper into terrain. His luxury vehicles couldn't navigate. Dawn was breaking when they finally caught up to the herd again. But this time, the horses had stopped. They stood on a familiar hill overlooking the valley where Meadowbrook Farm sprawled in the early light. Home, Vandemar's helicopter circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, its searchlight sweeping the ground. Other vehicles were arriving, from different directions, closing in on their prize. But as the net tightened, something extraordinary happened. The horses began to separate, moving in different directions with the precision of a military unit. Small groups broke away, disappearing into ravines and wooded areas that only someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain could navigate. Octavia realized she was witnessing something that went beyond instinct. This was intelligence, strategy. The horses were using the land itself as their ally, exploiting every hidden path and secret passage that generations of Kerrigan horses had learned. "They're not just running," she said in wonder. "They're thinking." Bellamy had stopped the vehicle on a ridge where they could observe without interfering. Below them, Maverick stood alone in an open meadow, clearly visible to the helicopter circling. Above, the other horses had vanished as if they'd never existed. He's sacrificing himself, Octavia realized, drawing their attention so the others can escape. The helicopter began to descend, and ground vehicles converged on Maverick's position. The Colt stood motionless, head high, waiting for capture with the dignity of a king facing execution. But Octavia wasn't about to let that happen. She was out of the vehicle and running before Bellamy could stop her, sliding down the hillside, on loose shale and determination. Behind her, she heard him curse and follow. But she was already sprinting across the meadow toward Maverick. The helicopter was 50 feet above ground when she reached the Colt. Without hesitation, she vaulted onto his back, feeling his muscles coil beneath her. For a moment, they stood there together, woman and horse, defiant against the machinery of wealth and power descending upon them. Then Maverick launched into motion, and Octavia understood why her ancestors had chosen this bloodline above all others. This wasn't just a horse. This was wind given form, lightning harnessed and directed by will and trust. They flew across the meadow as the helicopter struggled to match their speed and agility. Behind them, vehicles roared in pursuit, but Maverick knew this land like he knew his own heartbeat. He led them on a chase through terrain that tested every skill Octavia had learned growing up on horseback. But eventually, even the greatest heart must face limits. Maverick's breathing grew labored, his gait less sure. They were surrounded now, trapped in a box canyon with high walls on three sides, and Vandemar's forces blocking the only exit. End of the line, Vandemar's amplified voice echoed off the canyon walls as his helicopter landed. "You've caused me considerable expense, Ms. Kerrigan. I hope you're prepared to compensate for the damages." Octavia slid from Maverick's back, her hand remaining on his neck. The Colt was exhausted, sides heaving, but his eyes still held that indomitable spark that no amount of money could purchase. "The only thing I'm prepared to do," she said as Vandemar approached with his entourage, "is tell you exactly what I think of your compensations." But before she could continue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Not from the entrance where Vandemar's vehicles waited, but from above. Silhouetted against the dawn sky, 23 horses appeared on the canyon, rim like a vision from another century. They had come back for their leader, their family, their heart. And they hadn't come alone. The sight of the horses arranged along the canyon rim sent a chill through the assembled crowd. But what made Vandemar take an involuntary step backward wasn't the animals themselves, It was the people standing beside them, farmers, ranchers, horse trainers, veterinarians, people from every corner of the county, who had known and respected the Kerrigan family for generations. They sat their mounts with the easy confidence of those born to the saddle, and their faces held a unified expression of quiet determination. "Well," a familiar voice called from the canyon entrance, "this is quite a gathering." Judge Hamish Blackthorne rode into the canyon on a paint mare that had seen better decades but still carried herself with pride. At 73, the retired jurist was a pillar of the community, and his presence here sent a clear message about where local sentiment lay. Vandermoor's confidence flickered for the first time. "Judge Blackthorne, I wasn't aware you were interested in ranch operations." "Oh, I'm very interested in operations that affect my constituents," the judge replied mildly, "especially operations that might involve animal welfare violations." "Animal welfare," Vandermeer sputtered. "These horses received the finest care money can buy." "Funny thing about horses," said a new voice, Dr. Evangeline Cross, the county's most respected veterinarian, guided her horse down a narrow path that somehow allowed access to the canyon floor. "They're not just bodies to be maintained, they're complex emotional beings, and forcing them to live in conditions that cause psychological distress, well, that's something the state takes quite seriously these days." More riders appeared, descending into the canyon through paths that shouldn't have existed but somehow did. Each new arrival brought the same message. The community had chosen its side. Octavia felt Maverick relax beneath her touch, sensing the shift in energy. The Colt, who had seemed exhausted moments before, now stood straighter, his ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. Bellamy approached Vandermeer with a tablet, his expression grim. "Sir, I've been monitoring the news feeds. This situation has gone viral. #Savica Ruggan Horses is trending nationally." On the screen, drone footage showed the dramatic chase, the gathering of riders, and the standoff in the canyon. Social media was exploding with commentary about corporate greed versus small-town values, about the rights of animals versus the rights of ownership. But Judge Blackthorne wasn't finished. "There's also the matter of the auction itself," he continued conversationally. "I've been reviewing the foreclosure documents, and there appear to be some ... irregularities." Vandermeer's lawyer, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Your Honor, with respect, the auction was conducted according to all applicable laws." "Oh, I'm sure it was," the judge agreed. "Technically, but technicalities can be tricky things. For instance, did you know that Meadowbrook Farm was designated as a historic property last month? The paperwork was filed just before the foreclosure, but somehow got lost in bureaucratic shuffles." The color drained from Vandermeer's face. "That's impossible." "Nothing's impossible when people work together," said a voice from above. Prescott, the elderly farmer who had been renting pasture to Octavia, sat his ancient gelding on the canyon rim like a monument to stubbornness. "We've been busy these past few weeks. Busy learning about legal protections for historic properties. Busy discovering that certain auctions can be challenged under environmental protection statutes." More voices joined in, a chorus of legal challenges and regulatory concerns that had somehow materialized overnight. Octavia realized she was witnessing something extraordinary and entire. Community mobilizing to protect something they valued more than money. Dr. Cross dismounted and approached Maverick with the slow, careful movements of someone who understood horses. The Colt allowed her to examine him, his trust extending to anyone who had earned Octavia's approval. "This animal shows no signs of malnutrition or abuse," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "In fact, he appears to be in excellent health. The same cannot be said for the horses currently at Celestial Springs Ranch." She pulled out her own tablet, displaying veterinary reports that Bellamy recognized. "I've been consulting on the health crisis at Mr. Vandermeer's facility. 24 horses showing severe signs of psychological distress, refusing to eat, exhibiting behaviors consistent with separation, anxiety, and depression." "Those reports are confidential," Vandermeer snapped. "Were confidential," Dr. Cross corrected. "Animal welfare concerns override confidentiality agreements. The State Veterinary Board will be very interested in reviewing the conditions that could cause such widespread distress in previously healthy animals." The walls were closing in, and Vandermeer knew it. But he had one more card to play. Enough. He pulled out his phone, making a call while staring directly at Octavia. "Yes, this is Cornelius Vandermeer. I need an immediate transport helicopter, large capacity. I have livestock that needs to be relocated immediately." He ended the call with a smile that held no warmth. "Since everyone seems so concerned about animal welfare, I've decided to relocate my horses to a facility that can provide specialized care. There's a research facility in Nevada that's very interested in studying the psychological patterns of supposedly bonded animals. The threat hung in the air like poison. Research facility meant laboratory. Laboratory meant a fate worse than slaughter. But Octavia was no longer the heartbroken woman who had watched her family's legacy get auctioned away. She was the daughter of 5 generations of horse breeders, the inheritor of knowledge that went deeper than bloodlines and breeding records. She looked up at the riders surrounding the canyon, at the faces of people who had chosen to stand with her despite having no legal obligation to do so. Then she looked at Maverick, whose dark eyes held depths of understanding that transcended species. "Mr. Vandermeer," she said quietly, "I think you misunderstand something fundamental about ownership." She swung onto Maverick's back in one fluid motion, feeling the instant connection that made them more than human and horse. They were partners, united by bonds that no contract could create or destroy. You can own a horse's papers. You can own their physical bodies, but you can't own their spirit. You can't own their choice. And they've made their choice. Around the canyon, the other horses began to move, descending from impossible paths with their riders. Not retreating, but converging, coming together in a display of unity that transformed the standoff into something else entirely. A declaration, the approaching helicopter's rotors beat. A mechanical rhythm against the canyon walls, but it was drowned out by something far more powerful, the sound of dozens of horses and riders moving as one. They weren't fleeing or charging. They were simply there, present and united in a way that spoke of bonds deeper than ownership or law. Vandermeer watched his expensive solution approach from the east, while his expensive problems multiplied below. The helicopter would solve nothing if he couldn't actually load the horses. And looking at the determined faces surrounding him, that seemed increasingly unlikely. Sir Bellamy approached hesitantly. "The media coverage is ... extensive. CNN, Fox, NBC, they're all sending crews. This has become a national story." Indeed, news vans were already visible on the access roads, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like modern totems. Social media had transformed a local dispute into a symbol of something larger, the battle between corporate power and community values, between ownership and partnership. Judge Blackthorne cleared his throat. "Mr. Vandermeer, before this situation escalates further, I think there's something you should consider. I'm listening, Vandermeer said through gritted teeth. The horses at your facility are dying, the judge said bluntly. Not physically, perhaps, but in every way that matters. You've spent $42 million on animals that are worthless to you if they won't perform. Meanwhile, you're spending additional millions on security, transport, legal fees, and publicity problems. He gestured toward Octavia and Maverick. That young woman and her horse have just demonstrated something that all your money couldn't buy: the power of genuine connection. These animals didn't escape because they were mistreated. They escaped because they were homesick. Dr. Cross stepped forward, her medical bag in hand. I've been treating the horses at Celestial Springs, Mr. Vandermeer. Every standard therapy has failed, but I have a theory about what might heal them, which is, let them come home. The helicopter was circling now, looking for a place to land in the crowded canyon. But as it descended, something unexpected happened. The horses began to sing. It started with Maverick, a low whinnying that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. One by one, the other horses joined in, not the panicked cries of earlier, but something entirely different. A harmony of voices that spoke of unity, of belonging, of choices made freely rather than imposed by force. From their weapons, in the growing dawn light, with the ancient canyon walls rising around them, and the sound was so beautiful, so haunting, that even Vandermeer's security guards lowered their hands, the modern world intruding from above. The moment felt timeless. They're not just animals, Octavia said, her voice carrying clearly over the singing. They're family. And family can't be bought or sold or separated by legal documents. It can only be chosen. Vandermeer stared at her, then at the horses, then at the assembled crowd of people who had risked everything to be here. For the first time in decades, his carefully constructed worldview was cracking. What are you proposing? He asked, finally. Judge Blackthorne smiled. A trade. You return the horses to their home, to a community that values them for what they are rather than what they're worth. In exchange, you get something more valuable than livestock, which is the story of a man who chose compassion over profit, who demonstrated that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the connections we build with the world around us. The judge gestured toward the news crews setting up on the canyon rim. You're about to be famous, Mr. Van. The question is, what kind of famous do you want to be? Vandermeer looked around the canyon one more time. At Octavia, sitting straight and proud on a horse that had chosen loyalty over luxury. At the community that had rallied to defend something they couldn't afford to lose. At his own assistant, whose eyes held a mixture of hope and respect he hadn't seen in years. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the radio. Sir, should I land? Vandermeer stared at the radio for a long moment. Then he keyed the mic. Negative. Returned to base. The relief in the canyon was palpable, but Vandermeer wasn't done. Ms. Kerrigan, he called out. I have a different proposition. She waited, Maverick shifting restlessly beneath her. I'll return the horses, all of them, free and clear. He paused, something working behind his eyes. But I want something in return, which is, teach me, he said quietly. Teach me what you know about building connections that money can't buy. Show me how to earn the kind of loyalty I saw here today. The canyon fell silent except for the whisper of wind through stone. Octavia studied Vandermeer's face, looking for deception, for the trap that surely waited behind such an offer. But what she saw surprised her. For the first time since she'd met him, Cornelius Vandermeer looked like a man rather than a corporation. Uncertain, vulnerable, and genuinely curious about something that existed beyond his understanding. That kind of education, she said finally, takes time. Years, maybe. And it starts with learning that horses aren't possessions to be managed, they're partners to be earned. I have time, he said, and apparently I have a lot to learn. 3 months later, Meadowbrook Farm was alive again. Not as it had been, the financial reality made that impossible, but as something new. The Kerrigan-Vandermeer Equine Partnership was an unusual arrangement, one that combined Octavia's knowledge with Vandermeer's resources to create a breeding and training program. Based on partnership rather than domination, Vandermeer himself spent 2 days a week at the farm, learning to muck stalls and repair fences, discovering muscles he'd forgotten he had, and finding satisfaction in work that produced calluses rather than profits. He was still learning, still struggling with concepts that couldn't be quantified or leveraged. But he was trying, and in the pasture where Maverick grazed with his reunited family, the sound of contentment was sweeter than any song money could buy. The Colt, who had chosen love over luxury, had taught them all something valuable. True wealth isn't what you can afford to buy, it's what you can't afford to lose. And some things, the most important things, are always free.